Most people misunderstand avoidant individuals because they only judge the behavior they can see. They see someone pulling away after intimacy, becoming distant after emotional closeness, avoiding difficult conversations, or acting emotionally unavailable in moments where connection is needed the most. And from the outside, it looks cold. It looks selfish. It looks like they simply do not care. But psychology tells us something far deeper is happening beneath the surface. Avoidant attachment is not the absence of feeling. In many cases, it is the fear of feeling too much. That is the contradiction people fail to understand. The avoidant person often desires love, connection, intimacy, and emotional safety just as intensely as anyone else. But somewhere in their early emotional conditioning, closeness became associated with pain, pressure, criticism, disappointment, or loss of self. So now, as adults, they carry a nervous system that interprets intimacy not only as comfort, but also as danger. And this is where the entire pattern begins. A child who grows up emotionally dismissed, constantly criticized, emotionally neglected, or forced to suppress vulnerability learns an unconscious lesson very early: depending on people is unsafe. Expressing emotional needs becomes associated with rejection or shame. Over time, the mind adapts for survival. The child becomes emotionally self-reliant, disconnected from vulnerability, and deeply uncomfortable with dependency. But here is the important part. Survival strategies developed in childhood do not disappear in adulthood. They simply evolve. What once protected the child now sabotages the adult. So when an avoidant enters a relationship, the conflict begins internally long before it appears externally. Part of them wants closeness. Another part feels trapped by it. Part of them wants love. Another part fears losing control, freedom, or emotional safety. This is why avoidants often look confused even within their own relationships. Their behavior is not always logical because they are operating from emotional conditioning, not conscious intention. The human nervous system always chooses familiarity over happiness. Think about that for a moment. People do not automatically choose what is healthy. They choose what feels psychologically familiar. And for the avoidant, emotional distance feels familiar. Independence feels safe. Detachment feels controlled. Vulnerability, on the other hand, feels unpredictable. Intimacy requires surrender. It requires emotional exposure. It requires allowing another person to truly see you. And for someone who learned early in life that vulnerability leads to pain, that experience can activate deep internal anxiety, even when the relationship itself is healthy. That is why avoidance can suddenly pull away after moments of closeness. Not because the connection is meaningless, but because the connection is becoming emotionally real. This is also why many avoidants genuinely struggle to explain their own behavior. They may tell themselves they just need space, that they are not ready, or that something feels off, when in reality what feels off is emotional intimacy itself. The closer someone gets, the more their subconscious defense systems activate. And those defenses can appear in subtle ways: emotional withdrawal, reduced communication, hyper-focus on flaws in their partner, sudden emotional numbness, or the constant need to reclaim independence. These behaviors are not random. They are protective mechanisms designed to reduce emotional vulnerability. But here is the tragedy. The avoidant individual often suffers silently while appearing emotionally unaffected, because the same walls that protect them from pain also block them from experiencing the depth of connection they secretly crave. And over time, this creates a painful cycle of loneliness, confusion, and emotional disconnection. They may leave relationships not because love is absent, but because intimacy itself feels overwhelming to the nervous system they developed in survival mode. Real healing begins when people stop asking, "Why am I afraid of commitment?" and start asking, what taught me that love was unsafe in the first place? Because until the root is understood, the pattern repeats itself in every relationship, every connection, and every emotional decision. And the truth is, the greatest prison is not rejection from others. It is the inability to safely receive love when it finally arrives. One of the most emotionally confusing experiences in relationships is dealing with someone who constantly sends mixed signals. One day they are warm, affectionate, emotionally present, and deeply engaged. They text first. They initiate connection. They make you feel chosen, valued, even emotionally safe. And then suddenly, without warning, something changes. They become distant. Their energy shifts. Communication slows down. Vulnerability disappears. You begin questioning yourself, questioning the relationship, and questioning what happened. And this inconsistency is often the emotional signature of avoidant attachment. Not because avoidants intentionally want to manipulate people, but because they are trapped in a psychological conflict between desire and fear. This is what most people fail to understand. Avoidants do not usually fear relationships at the beginning. In fact, early-stage connection often feels exciting because it still contains emotional distance, mystery, and control. At the start, intimacy exists in small doses. There is enough space for attraction without full emotional exposure. But as the relationship deepens, the emotional stakes change. Expectations grow, vulnerability increases, emotional dependence becomes possible. And that is the moment the avoidant nervous system begins to react. Suddenly, closeness no longer feels exciting. It feels threatening. The very connection they once pursued now activates subconscious fear. And this creates a push-pull dynamic that leaves both people emotionally exhausted. The avoidant moves toward connection when they feel safe from emotional engulfment, but pulls away the moment intimacy becomes too real. Their nervous system is constantly trying to regulate emotional discomfort. So when things feel too close, they create distance. When things feel too distant, they seek reconnection. This cycle is not random. It is emotional survival operating beneath conscious awareness. What makes this dynamic especially painful is that the avoidance affection is often genuine. Their moments of closeness are real. Their care is real. Their attraction is real. But consistency requires emotional safety, and many avoidants never learned how to feel safe inside sustained intimacy. They learned how to survive emotionally, not how to remain emotionally present. So instead of communicating fear directly, they unconsciously express it through inconsistency. Silence becomes protection. Withdrawal becomes regulation. Emotional detachment becomes control. And the partner on the receiving end usually interprets this personally. They think, maybe I asked for too much. Maybe I became too emotional. Maybe I'm not enough. But in many cases, the issue has very little to do with the partner's worth. The avoidant is not reacting to the person as much as they are reacting to what emotional closeness represents internally. Because intimacy activates unresolved fears they may not even fully understand themselves. Fear of losing independence. Fear of being controlled. Fear of disappointing someone. Fear of emotional dependency. Fear of being truly seen. This is why avoidants often communicate indirectly. Instead of saying, I'm overwhelmed by emotional closeness right now, they may become distracted, emotionally unavailable, overly focused on work, irritated by small things, or suddenly uncertain about the relationship. The subconscious mind is incredibly intelligent at creating distance without directly admitting fear. And the more emotionally intense the relationship becomes, the stronger these defenses often grow. But there's another side to this pattern that people rarely discuss. Avoidants are also confused by their own inconsistency. Many genuinely do not understand why they pull away from people they care about. One part of them deeply wants connection, while another part experiences closeness as psychological pressure. So they live in a constant internal contradiction. They crave intimacy while resisting it at the same time. And until that contradiction is consciously addressed, every relationship becomes emotionally unstable. The deeper truth here is that mixed signals are often the language of unresolved emotional conflict. People who are internally divided create externally confusing relationships. And when someone has spent years disconnecting from vulnerability, emotional consistency becomes difficult because intimacy itself activates fear beneath the surface. That is why emotional maturity is not measured by how intensely someone feels in the moment. It is measured by their ability to remain emotionally present even when closeness becomes uncomfortable. Because real love is not found in emotional highs and lows. Real love is found in the courage to stop running when connection becomes real. One of the most puzzling aspects of avoidant attachment is this strange emotional paradox. They struggle to fully commit, yet they also struggle to fully let go. And for the person on the receiving end, this creates enormous confusion. Because if someone truly does not want connection, why do they keep coming back? Why do they continue checking in, watching from a distance, sending subtle signals, or reopening emotional doors they once closed themselves? The answer lies deep inside the psychology of emotional self-protection. Avoidants are often caught between two competing fears that constantly battle inside them. The fear of losing themselves in intimacy and the fear of being completely abandoned. And when a person is living between those two fears, they remain emotionally suspended. Never fully in, never fully gone. This is why many avoidants maintain what psychologists sometimes call emotional proximity without emotional vulnerability. They want access to the connection without fully surrendering to it. They may disappear for weeks, then suddenly send a message. They may resist commitment, yet become uncomfortable when their partner moves on. They may avoid emotional conversations, yet continue monitoring the relationship from a distance. And to someone experiencing this behavior, it can feel manipulative or confusing. But often what you are witnessing is unresolved attachment conflict operating beneath conscious awareness. Human beings are wired for connection. Even people who fear intimacy still crave emotional significance. The avoidant is no exception. The difference is that closeness activates anxiety in them instead of safety. So they constantly try to manage connection in controlled doses. Too much intimacy feels overwhelming. Too much distance feels lonely. As a result, they unconsciously create relationships that allow them to hover emotionally in the middle. Close enough to avoid abandonment. Distant enough to avoid vulnerability. And this emotional limbo becomes psychologically addictive for both people involved. The avoidant feels temporary relief because they never have to fully confront their deepest fears. Meanwhile, the partner remains emotionally attached because the connection is never completely resolved. There is always another message, another return, another emotional reopening. The human mind struggles to let go of unfinished emotional experiences. Uncertainty creates obsession. Intermittent emotional reinforcement is one of the most powerful psychological forces in human behavior. It is the same principle that makes gambling addictive. The unpredictability itself keeps people emotionally invested. But beneath all of this is a deeper philosophical truth about avoidant individuals. Many of them do not know how to emotionally tolerate permanence. Commitment feels permanent. Deep intimacy feels permanent. And permanence requires trust. Not just trust in another person, but trust in themselves. Trust that they can remain emotionally safe inside connection. Trust that vulnerability will not destroy their independence. Trust that emotional closeness does not equal emotional suffocation. And because that trust was often damaged early in life, they keep relationships emotionally incomplete as a way to maintain psychological control. This is why avoidants often leave relationships physically before they leave emotionally. Their body creates distance long before their emotions fully detach. And sometimes they continue carrying emotional attachment for years while appearing detached on the surface. Because avoidance is not the absence of attachment. In many cases, it is attachment complicated by fear. The tragedy is that this pattern prevents genuine peace for everyone involved. The avoidant never experiences the security of fully surrendering to love, while the other person never experiences the clarity of complete emotional closure. Both remain trapped in uncertainty. One fears engulfment, the other fears abandonment. And the relationship becomes a cycle of emotional almosts. Almost commitment, almost vulnerability, almost love fully expressed. But life cannot be lived fully in emotional half measures. At some point, every human being must decide whether they will continue protecting themselves from pain or finally become strong enough to experience connection without running from it. Because the longer someone lives with one foot in and one foot out, the more they delay the very intimacy, healing, and freedom they are secretly searching for. Avoidant individuals often build their identity around independence. They pride themselves on being self-sufficient, emotionally controlled, low maintenance, and unaffected by the chaos of relationships. On the surface, this can appear strong. In a world where emotional dependence is often criticized, independence becomes attractive. People admire the person who seems untouchable, composed, and fully in control of themselves. But there is a profound difference between healthy independence and emotional isolation. One is rooted in confidence. The other is rooted in protection. And many avoidants confuse the two without even realizing it. Healthy independence says, I can survive on my own, but I can also connect deeply with others. Emotional isolation says, I cannot risk needing anyone because dependency feels dangerous. That distinction changes everything. Because true emotional strength is not the absence of vulnerability. True emotional strength is the ability to remain open without losing yourself. But avoidants often learned very early in life that emotional needs were inconvenient, unsafe, or disappointing. Maybe vulnerability was ignored. Maybe affection was inconsistent. Maybe emotional expression was met with criticism, rejection, or emotional unavailability. Whatever the experience was, the nervous system adapted. The child learned to rely on themselves emotionally because relying on others no longer felt safe. Over time, this adaptation becomes identity. The avoidant begins telling themselves a story. I do not need anyone. And at first, that belief feels empowering. It creates control. Distance reduces emotional risk. Self-reliance becomes a shield against disappointment. But the problem is that human beings are not designed for emotional isolation. We are biologically wired for connection. Study after study in psychology and neuroscience confirms that emotional closeness, trust, and secure relationships are essential to mental and physical well-being. The nervous system regulates through safe human connection. Yet avoidants often spend years resisting the very thing their psychology secretly needs most. And this resistance creates a hidden form of loneliness that many avoidants struggle to admit, even to themselves. Because loneliness does not always look emotional on the outside. Sometimes it looks functional, productive, independent, successful. Some avoidants immerse themselves in work, goals, routines, distractions, or constant self-improvement because achievement feels safer than intimacy. Accomplishment is predictable. Relationships are not. In achievement, they remain in control. In intimacy, they must confront uncertainty, vulnerability, and emotional exposure. This is why avoidants often feel uncomfortable around highly emotional situations. Vulnerability forces them into emotional territory they spent years learning to avoid. And when someone attempts to get close emotionally, the avoidant nervous system may interpret that closeness as pressure rather than connection. So they withdraw, they intellectualize feelings instead of experiencing them. They minimize emotional needs. They convince themselves they simply value space more than others. But beneath that distance is often fear, not freedom. The deeper tragedy is that emotional walls do not selectively block pain. They block everything. The same wall that protects someone from rejection also blocks intimacy. The same defense that prevents disappointment also prevents deep trust, emotional safety, and authentic love. Avoidants often believe they are protecting their peace, when in reality, they are protecting their fear. And over time, this emotional self-protection becomes emotionally expensive. Relationships remain surface level. Connection feels temporary. Emotional fulfillment becomes difficult to sustain because the heart is never fully allowed to open. Philosophically, this raises one of the most important questions about human life. Is safety without connection truly freedom? Because many people spend years avoiding emotional pain, only to discover they have also avoided emotional depth. They protected themselves so well that nobody could truly reach them anymore. And eventually, emotional control becomes emotional imprisonment. Real growth begins when the avoidant realizes that vulnerability is not weakness. Dependency is not the enemy. Emotional closeness is not the loss of self. In fact, the strongest people are not the ones who feel nothing. The strongest people are the ones who can experience intimacy without running from the discomfort it brings. Because at the end of the day, a life built entirely on self-protection may feel safe, but it will never feel fully alive. Loving an avoidant person can become one of the most emotionally intense experiences someone will ever go through, not simply because of the person themselves, but because of the psychological dynamic the relationship creates. What makes these relationships so powerful is not constant love or constant rejection. It is inconsistency. Human beings are emotionally affected most deeply by unpredictability. When affection is steady, the nervous system eventually relaxes into security. But when love appears and disappears unpredictably, the brain becomes hyper-focused on the connection. The relationship starts to feel emotionally addictive because the mind is constantly searching for certainty that never fully arrives. This is why people often say relationships with avoidance feel intoxicating in the beginning. The emotional highs can feel extraordinary. When an avoidant opens up, becomes vulnerable, expresses affection, or allows closeness, it feels incredibly meaningful because it is rare. Their moments of emotional openness carry intensity precisely because they are inconsistent. The partner begins associating those moments with emotional reward. And then, just as connection deepens, the avoidant pulls away. Distance replaces closeness. Silence replaces reassurance. And now the other person becomes emotionally consumed, trying to restore the connection that once felt so powerful. Psychologically, this creates what is known as intermittent reinforcement, one of the strongest conditioning mechanisms in human behavior. When rewards are unpredictable, emotional attachment intensifies. The brain releases dopamine not only from receiving affection, but from anticipating it. This is why people can become deeply attached to emotionally inconsistent relationships, even when those relationships are painful. The uncertainty itself creates obsession. The mind begins chasing emotional validation instead of experiencing emotional peace. And this is where many people lose themselves. Instead of asking, is this relationship healthy for me? They begin asking, how do I make this person stay? Their self-worth slowly becomes tied to winning emotional consistency from someone who cannot consistently provide it. They overanalyze texts, moods, pauses, and emotional shifts. They become hyper-aware of every change in energy. And eventually the relationship stops feeling like partnership and starts feeling like emotional survival. But there is a deeper reason these relationships affect people so profoundly. Avoidance often trigger unresolved emotional wounds in others. Especially in people with anxious attachment patterns, the avoidant dynamic activates deep fears of abandonment, rejection, and emotional unworthiness. The anxious partner pursues closeness. The avoidant retreats. The more one chases, the more the other distances themselves. And this creates a painful emotional dance where both people are reacting from fear rather than operating from emotional security. What makes this dynamic especially heartbreaking is that genuine feelings often exist on both sides. The avoidant may truly care. They may genuinely miss the person when they are gone. They may even experience deep internal conflict about why they cannot sustain closeness. But care alone does not create healthy love. Emotional availability does. Consistency does. Presence does. And many people remain trapped in emotionally painful relationships because they confuse emotional intensity with emotional depth. But intensity is not the same as intimacy. Chaos is not connection. Emotional longing is not proof of compatibility. The truth is, relationships are supposed to bring emotional expansion, not constant emotional confusion. Love should challenge you to grow, but it should not force you to constantly question your value. Yet many people become addicted to the emotional roller coaster because the temporary moments of closeness feel euphoric after periods of distance. The nervous system becomes conditioned to associate love with emotional uncertainty. And once that pattern forms, calm, stable relationships can even begin to feel unfamiliar or boring because the body has adapted to chaos as emotional stimulation. This is why healing requires more than simply understanding the avoidant person. It also requires understanding yourself. Why are you emotionally attached to inconsistency? Why does emotional unavailability feel so powerful? Why are you fighting so hard for love that continuously destabilizes your peace? Those questions matter because awareness breaks emotional cycles. At some point, every person must learn the difference between fighting for love and fighting for emotional access to someone who is unavailable. Because the strongest form of love is not losing yourself while trying to be chosen by someone else. The strongest form of love is maintaining your emotional wholeness even when someone cannot fully meet you where you stand. The most important thing to understand about avoidant attachment is that it is not a life sentence. These patterns may feel deeply ingrained, but human beings are not fixed. The brain changes. The nervous system adapts. Emotional conditioning can be rewritten when awareness meets intentional action. But healing begins with one uncomfortable truth. Avoidance cannot heal while continuing to run from vulnerability. The very thing they learn to avoid is the doorway to the connection they secretly crave. And this is where transformation becomes possible. Because once someone becomes conscious of their patterns, they stop reacting automatically. They begin recognizing the moment they emotionally shut down, withdraw, detach, or create distance. Instead of escaping intimacy, they learn to stay present inside it. That does not mean the fear instantly disappears. It means they stop allowing fear to control their decisions. Emotional growth is not the absence of discomfort. It is the ability to move through discomfort without abandoning connection. This requires emotional honesty at a level many avoidants have never practiced before. Learning to communicate fear instead of disguising it as disinterest. Learning to express needs instead of suppressing them. Learning to tolerate closeness without immediately interpreting it as loss of freedom. And perhaps most importantly, learning that intimacy does not erase individuality. Healthy relationships do not consume people, they expand them. But healing also requires compassion. Not excuses, not denial, but compassion. Because many avoidants developed these defenses long before they had the emotional maturity to choose differently. What once protected them emotionally became automatic. The problem is that survival strategies designed for childhood often become destructive in adult relationships. So healing is really the process of teaching the nervous system a new truth. Connection can be safe. Vulnerability can coexist with strength. Love does not have to end in emotional loss. And this is where real power exists. Not in emotional detachment. Not in pretending not to care. Real power is the ability to remain emotionally open in a world that constantly teaches people to protect themselves. Anyone can run when intimacy becomes uncomfortable. Anyone can build walls. But it takes enormous emotional strength to stay present, communicate honestly, and allow yourself to be fully seen. Because in the end, the goal of life is not simply to avoid pain. The goal is to become strong enough to experience love without fear controlling your ability to receive it. At the core of every avoidant pattern is not a lack of love, but a fear of what love demands. Intimacy asks people to lower their defenses, to risk vulnerability, to trust another human being with the parts of themselves they spent years protecting. And for avoidance, that can feel terrifying. So they learn to survive through distance, emotional control, and self-protection. But survival and fulfillment are not the same thing. A person can protect themselves from pain for years and still feel profoundly disconnected from the very thing they want most. What makes this dynamic so tragic is that both people often suffer in silence. The avoidant struggles with closeness while secretly craving connection. The partner struggles with inconsistency while desperately trying to hold the relationship together. And somewhere in the middle, love becomes tangled with fear, confusion, and emotional exhaustion. But awareness changes everything. The moment people begin understanding the psychological roots beneath these patterns, they stop personalizing every emotional withdrawal and start seeing the deeper emotional wounds driving the behavior. And that is the real message here. Human beings are shaped by their past, but they are not imprisoned by it. Attachment styles explain behavior, but they do not excuse remaining emotionally unavailable forever. Healing is possible when people become willing to confront the fears they spent their lives avoiding. Because real intimacy is not built through perfection. It is built through emotional courage. The courage to communicate honestly, the courage to stay present when vulnerability feels uncomfortable, the courage to stop running from connection the moment it becomes real. At the end of the day, every relationship forces us to answer one question. Will we continue protecting ourselves from pain, or will we finally become strong enough to experience love without hiding from it? Because the deepest relationships are never created by people who feel no fear. They are created by people who choose connection despite it.